People just really feel like their design job is completely gone and they're going to be automated out of it. And I feel half of my conversation is just relax. You're fine. You've got a job.
AI is changing the role of the designer and shifting how product teams succeed. We have a special guest, Scott Jenson, formerly from Apple, Google, and Frog Design.
All I know is that the only way forward is through, and that we have to be building these things. And I am quite sure that we'll be building far less than people think we're going to be building because the tools are overhyped. And it's that kind of maniacal insistence that I have on building things and learning that is the only technique I have to kind of see our way through this.
We discuss why designers feel like their entire job will go away, what advice he offers to the teams and individuals he coaches, how AI is overhyped and where it will actually have impact, lessons from working at the forefront of mobile technology, why Google, Apple, Meta, Microsoft are all racing to get there first, and recommendations to build successful products today. This conversation is more of a coaching session for designers, researchers, and product teams trying to navigate this time of great change. We try and cut through the hype to distill out key lessons that will help you all in your careers.
I do feel like this cookie cutter approach comes from the fact that people feel like there's no more growth. We're just doing the same basic things anymore. And exactly to your point, there's always cool more things we can do. And they're not encouraged to have that curiosity.
Scott Jenson has worked in user interface design and strategic planning for over 30 years. He was the first member of the System, Software, Human Interface group at Apple in the late 80s and worked on the Newton Digital Assistant. After Apple, he was a freelance digital consultant, doing work for Netscape, Mayo Clinic, American Express, and several web startups. Then director of product design for Symbian, then managed mobile UI design at Google for 6 years and left to become creative director at Frog Design. But he returned to Google to work on advanced UX concepts for IoT and Android at Google. He holds more than 35 patents. Please subscribe to Design of AI, the podcast for product teams, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Substack. We interview leaders and practitioners at the forefront of AI to help product teams navigate where and how to leverage AI.
Scott, you've spent a large part of your career with Apple, Google, Frog Design. You've worked on some pretty monumental products. But when we spoke with you last week, it sounded like you're most proud of coaching and mentoring others to success. What do you find so fulfilling about that?
What I find so interesting is that people really underestimate the value of luck in their career. And I just feel like I've had a good career. I'm very, very proud of what I've done, but I also appreciate how lucky I am to be where I am. And so I just like giving back. And so that's why I've been doing these mentoring programs. It just helps me help people that are kind of coming up. But it's not necessarily like it's better than what I did. It's just kind of a new stage. I've kind of stopped working full time, and I've now got a bunch of individual projects that I'm working on, and it's just a good use of my time to help people now afterwards. And I really enjoy that aspect of talking to them and grappling with their issues.
And what are you finding are the common barriers, the common issues?
So much of it boils down to interpersonal skills. I find I almost never talk about a specific Figma issue or an interview technique or a way of doing journey mapping. That almost never comes up. It's almost always this idea of how do you communicate with the other people on your team and just navigate that, because it's just really hard. And even though I think teams are all set up to, the whole team needs to develop a product, for whatever reason, UX people seem to be at the front edge, and we're the ones that feel the pain first. And we're often characterized as kind of whiny complainers. And the ability to actually find these things and to present them to the team in a way that's helpful is a skill, because you're the ones that see the problems first. And negotiating that, I think, just takes a lot of practice.
And to that point, what's the sentiment right now around AI with product teams?
It's fear. It's just so much fear. People just really feel like their design job is completely gone and they're going to be automated out of it. And I feel half of my conversation is just relax. You're fine. You've got a job. Now, absolutely, this is an impactful technology and it's going to change how we work, but it's not going to take your job away. And what's so frustrating is I see senior people in this community say just that, And it just drives me crazy because it's scaring people to death.
You've been really outspoken about your concerns about AI. You said there's a mindless panic about AI and that a lot of projects are motivated by a fear of not getting there first rather than solving an actual user need. Do you have any examples of what's making you want to speak out on this topic?
Well, there was the experience that I had at Google, which prompted my very first post. And I can't go into the specifics of that, obviously, but there's just this feeling that there's a pony here somewhere and we don't know what it's like and we just have to just rush in and do it. And so you see this with some companies just bolting on a chatbot to the side. But what I'm mostly seeing is this kind of mindless extrapolation of what it can do. There's this assumption that AI may not do it now, but it will do it soon. And it's almost more this because of the way social media works, we've almost got this systemic thing where not only leaders are doing this, but people on social media are doing this, where everyone has to have an opinion. Everyone has to like get ahead of the curve. And so we're instead of doing what I think UX people normally do, which is just prototype and learn, people are doing these snap judgments. And it's this snap judgment that I think is creating all sorts of false starts. And I think that's the thing I'm trying to suggest is that I believe that this generative AI has got a lot of potential, but we just have to back up just a little bit.
Yeah. Given where you've worked, and obviously you worked at some of the biggest tech megacorps in the world, what is the prize though for whoever gets this?
Well, it's why I talk about the Gartner hype cycle so much. And I think most people are familiar with that. If not, just go to the Wikipedia page. It'll do a good job of explaining it to you. People, when something starts to get hype, it seems to be this exponential fire and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's, I think, what the issue is that we are extrapolating where it's going to go. And it always falls. And having a long career, started in the 80s, I've just seen this cycle so often. So it's not like we're not going to have a good use for this technology, but we just have to just calm down a little bit. There's an awful lot of people that are worried about it. There is this kind of gold rush mentality. I hope that what happened last week, or is the beginning of this week with Apple, when they announced their AI, Apple Intelligence, shows that you can be very late to the party and people can still be very attracted to what you're doing. So I'm hoping that cooler heads will prevail and they'll realize that you don't have to be first. The winner doesn't, the first person to the trough doesn't win. And so that we can get this more rational, calm exploration and actually find real value,
Yeah.
because that's actually what's going to really, help.
You speak a lot about hype cycles, right? And this is a hype cycle. No matter what anyone thinks, it doesn't matter whether you're on the negative or the positive sentiment on AI. This is oddly similar to, crypto, Web3, 3D printing. Like there's been so many of these hype cycles. But most notably, 10 years ago, Siri and Google and all these other different assistants really kicked off this belief that AI was going to be this revolution. And then that hype cycle died off, and then new hype cycles came. I'm wondering what lessons you might be able to share from working through hype cycles so we can avoid the risks.
That's hard because UX people are usually, more in a subservient role. We've been asking for years to have a seat at the table, but for most UX people, you aren't the chief product officer. And there are chief product officers, don't get me wrong. But I mean, I'm assuming that the people that you're talking about are the ones that are just in the trenches with everyone else. And how do you handle that?
This Design of AI episode is brought to you by PH1, a research and strategy consultancy that helps clients build AI products that customers want. Contact them about product discovery research to answer critical questions about what to build, competitive analysis to find out how to gain an advantage, service and customer analysis to identify the best use cases and value drivers, and workshops and concept testing to validate what will work and to fine-tune products. PH1 has worked on products for Spotify, Microsoft, the National Football League, Dell, Mozilla, Bell, and various health and higher education groups. Bring in an expert to make sure your products and teams are focused on what customers want. Visit their website to book an intro call, ph1.ca. Let's look back a couple of years, right? A ton of funding went into Web3 products. Funding went into the initial voice projects, and then the funding just dries up. Those startups die. What it's like working in these orgs or coaching some of the people about how they have to adapt their philosophies when there's just such an onus on something that doesn't exist yet, really.
Yeah. There's this very dark saying that comes from medics in the Korean War. The patient always stops bleeding, which is a bit dark, but it means, for me, I think the same thing is happening now, which is companies always figure out the new hype technology. The question is, does the company survive? And so there's this certain weird things that happens in capitalist markets where these companies just throw themselves into the breach, and you get dozens if not hundreds of companies, and the vast majority of them fail. We just burn through all this money. A couple get lucky, a couple actually are smart and figure it out and they get through. It almost feels like we have to have these dead bodies on the ground and there's no way around it. And all I'm trying to say as a UX designer is that my job is to save the company money, right? There's a well-known aphorism that says months of programming can save you days of critical thinking, right? And so the idea here is to say, we've seen this happen. The bodies get thrown into the breach. We've seen it fail over and over and over again. What are we going to do about it? And so my point is to say there is no magic pill. You have to know that if you don't do anything, you're going to be one of those spots on the wall. So how do you back up? How do you figure out what's going on? And how do you have a better shot at making it through that breach?
Recently, I've been very excited about this podcast episode someone did with the CEO of writer.com. I posted about it on the Design of AI LinkedIn page. But what was interesting about this episode is she went into quite a lot of detail about how she doesn't view building this business any different than any other business. And she avoids innovation money. She just tries to land a deal, listen to the customers, expand it, all the first principle type stuff. But meanwhile, the hype cycle is pushing people to do things beyond first principles. They're not listening to what should be and what needs to happen, which I think is interesting. So, anyways, that interview is fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to how businesses are integrating it so that there's fewer of these dead bodies like you're talking about, right?
The original UX paper was written back in the 1960s, is a Harvard Business School review. It's called Marketing Myopia, that said exactly what you just said. Just focus on the customer. What is their pain point? What do they need? And so this has been known for 60 years at least. And it is interesting how we just keep not learning the lesson.
Our audience is largely teams that are being asked to build these AI products or being pushed to really quickly implement AI tools to help meet targets. We were talking a minute ago about learning our lesson and how to create more sustainable businesses around AI and getting through the war, if you will. What advice do you have for these people, these UX designers that are being asked to take on such a difficult task?
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of repeat what I said before, which is we just have to understand what this technology is good at. A lot of times people use the material metaphor. We're using a new material, right? The web was a material, mobile was a material, and now this new generative AI is a material. But what's the grain? What is it good at? And I don't think we have a rich enough vocabulary. So part of my job now is I'm coaching some small startup companies, and we were talking just this morning with one of them about hallucinating, which is another term I hate because we anthropomorphize this too much, right? But hallucination is the word of the day. And we got confused as to what hallucination meant. And they were using it in a general way, and they were shutting down the conversation and said, wait a second, when does it hallucinate and how does it hallucinate? And we pulled it apart. We don't need to go into the context with this conversation, but we had a more nuanced definition then of what hallucination was. And then we were able to say, oh, look, it actually is okay over here. So I'm a big believer in creating vocabulary. So a lot of what UX design does is creates design artifacts, whether it's a journey map or a user test or whatever. There's all these, and I would argue that we need a lot more of these design artifacts. We need to build these prototypes to say, okay, it's really, so for example, almost every successful thing we've seen right now with generative AI has then been text-based because that's what it's good at. It's excellent at analyzing, categorizing, and generating text. But every single thing I've seen in Figma has been a disaster, right? It's just been horrible. Now, am I trying to say that Figma will never be used? No, no. I'm just saying it's harder. And we can talk about the fact that it has a lack of training data. It's not as much text based and so forth. So there's lots of ways in which I think we should be having this conversation is to say what's an easy problem, what's a hard problem, and then using that learning to then have these product conversations to at least lean into the easier things first until we get our feet wet.
I love that idea that as UX people, whether you're a designer, researcher, strategist, whatever, that we need to be doing a much better job of building out vocabularies and creating common vocabularies between us as businesses and our customers and users. I think there's just in general a really big gap in that type of work, whether that be for AI products or just generally products and tools overall. And if we take a look back at the tech side of it, you mentioned that we need to know what the tech is good at. So, what would you advise people to understand? Like, what do we believe that this tech is good at right now?
I'm trying to collect these stories myself. I don't know, but I'm trying to learn. And what I find most interesting is people that use an LLM right now as mostly a text engine, and they strap something on the beginning or they strap something on the end. So there's a colleague of mine in information architecture did a text analysis, and he discovered he could output it as a CSV file. So he did his little prompt engineering, and then he had a little program that took that output and drew some really lovely graphs. Okay, the graphs had nothing to do with generative AI, but he got the thing to do that. So this points to me a really interesting model, which is to say, can we have more interesting inputs and more interesting outputs? And what does that work? So Apple this week, when they announced the fact that they're going to massively increase the number of intents in their applications, is an example of just that. Right. So Siri will be able to take your question and then hopefully do some type of JSON like output that we won't see. And then it'll pass that off to the applications and then actually get more interesting things done. That to me is an example of figuring out where you stop being an LLM and you stop being something else. But even that, by the way, is going to be problematic because it's one thing to say, make a meeting, but it's entirely something else to say, I want to make a romantic reservation with my wife and order some flowers. That is going to be significantly more complicated. So there's going to be levels of what you can do with these bookends. And we just need to build out that thing. And it wouldn't surprise me that people are going to over index on what that can do too.
It's interesting you say that. So this weekend, I had lunch with a friend of mine, and he was showing me a site called make.com. And what's fascinating about it is that there's so much hype put onto OpenAI and learning how to use ChatGPT and going through the odyssey of trying to get prompts to actually do some. But there's this whole battalion of startups that have figured out how to build these amazing automations with it. And he showed me basically that his company built an entire product line without writing a single line of code. And now they're making recurrent revenue off of it. So sometimes when we think about use cases and what we should be designing for, sometimes maybe we're being a little too egotistical and too focused on using the first order tools when the second order tools have already figured that out for us. And we should be using the tools available rather than the raw capability.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
wondering what you think designers should be designing for.
Well, there's that classic Marshall McLuhan quote about we march backwards into the future. And ultimately, I think that there will be a significant impact and it will completely change the whole landscape in the sense that if we do have these bookends I talked about before, it at some point, I think that's a ways away. So I'm being a little hypey myself right now, but we're going to redefine what an app even is, right? Whatever make.com does, we'll get to the point where it's an individual user. I want to follow these things, keep an eye on it. When this happens, give me an alert, give me a chart, and give me a list. So you can start getting bespoke stuff all the time. And I think that's going to be an interesting process to follow. But to your point, make.com is just leaning into what generative AI is really good at, which is, talking in terms of programming. I think a lot of us have been trying to do programming with ChatGPT, and it's astoundingly good. So to me, make.com is just leaning into that very obvious capability and using it. So I'm trying to answer you basically in a short term and a long term way that make.com is not surprising. And what may be surprising is how that ripples through the ecosystem over the next 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a lot of what we've been talking about is just this idea that designers and UX people in general are going to have to really lean into things that maybe they're uncomfortable with, understanding, what AI can do well, and figuring out those use cases for their specific business and within their specific roles. But if we think about it, it also means that these people are going to have to start having really difficult, awkward conversations internally in those organizations, whether that's about vision, strategy, just about prioritizing and whether a product even should be pushed forward into market. And this is a very different and difficult skill that people maybe haven't had to practice in the same way. So, what tips or advice do you have for people that need to have these awkward conversations when maybe they haven't had them in the past and are really wanting to advocate for the right products or the right tools for the users of their business?
God, that's such a great question, and it's so hard. And I think the answer has nothing to do with generative AI. It has, and we were talking at the beginning about when I was mentoring students and talking to them about it. It's this exact point. I learned a long time ago that when you're in that situation, the one thing you don't do is say no, right? Because you just become an impediment and you become a problem. We had this kind of running joke at Frog Design that we weren't in the design business, we were in the design therapy business. And how do you lead people to a good solution? So the trick in that case is about seeing the social picture. So, for example, in the short term, often what you do is you say yes, which sounds like you're selling out. But what you're trying to do is to just listen to that person and figure out what they're asking, say yes enough so that you can kind of get them to explain it more, and then do a very quick and short sketch of what they're doing. Because that does a couple of things. One is it establishes a little bit more trust. They believe you a little bit more. They know that you're listening to them. And more, the only way to get through this problem is to have trust between people. And so listening to them and doing exactly what they say is an exercise to build that. And guess what? You actually may discover that they're not crazy, that what they're asking for is actually reasonable. So you have to be open to learning as well. But in the process of doing that, hopefully you're fast enough and quick enough that you can build enough sketches that you can say, okay, I did what you said, but here's this issue. I discovered this problem. And you know what? What do you think about these other alternatives? So it's like improv, right? Improv is never no, it's yes and. So you take the improv approach and you say yes and you provide alternatives and you try to build that conversation up. And if you can pull in an engineer who believes like you do, and the two of you can actually build something together, that even has more punch because now it's or three of you and you're working on multiple levels and you can kind of build again this conversation. And that often works. Not always, but it's the most productive way I found.
So, it sounds like building cross functional allies and partnerships within the organization are going to be really key to being able to stand your ground and stand for what you believe will be the best use of AI or the best features to roll out.
That and listening. I just think that UX designers are shockingly bad at listening, even though we keep thinking that we're user testing. We listen to our clients, but we don't listen to our stakeholders very well. So just listen to them and treat them as a user test situation. Ask questions. What are they trying to get at? What's important? And you may discover that what they're after isn't that crazy, or you can understand what's motivating it, and then you can give them an answer that still answers their main question.
Now, going back to the idea of coaching designers and thinking about their capabilities, something we chatted about before is that I think I saw a stat that there's something like 2 million UX professionals now. And that's insane, right? And that shows the scale of the UX education industry and the number of boot camps that are out there. But when I talk to an average designer doing average projects, they're really good at pushing buttons and templates and cookie cutter things. And that's what they've been taught to do. This moment is one where you as a designer can actually focus on behavior change. You can focus on, big long-term outcomes. You can answer this, solve the problems that you've always wished you could. Have you been able, or have designers been open to the idea of changing perspectives on what design means in this era and their own ability to influence people in positive ways and potentially negative ways as well?
I think that is the $1 million question. I think that's what separates junior from senior designers because so often it is just you're using the design system, right? What has made things really challenging over, I think, the last 5 or 6 years is so many problems have been solved, right? I mean, there's only so many ways to do a restaurant website, there's so many ways to do a banking app. Back around 2012, we were constantly innovating over what the pull to refresh was supposed to look like. And now people just do the same thing all the time. So the fact that we now have a much bigger catalog of done problems, I think gets people, like you said, to kind of feel more cookie cutter. In fact, I think that's even what feeds this whole AI and Figma will kill my job because everyone feels that everything's been a solved problem. So to your point, I do feel like this cookie cutter approach comes from the fact that people feel like there's no more growth. We're just doing the same basic things anymore. And exactly to your point, there's always cool more things we can do. And they're not encouraged to have that curiosity. And so I agree with you. I think there's a tremendous amount that we can do here, but it's scary. And so many companies don't want to hear it. And so there's always this idea that you kind of have to sneak it in. Someone asks you to do something boring. So again, you do the boring thing and then you do the extra stuff and you tie it back to some boring thing like business goals so they'll listen to you. But you often, which is a sad thing to say, you have to sneak innovation in sometimes.
The word innovation has leaked into our conversations a lot lately, largely because it's really vague. The word innovation doesn't even mean the same thing to everybody. And right now, we're in this cycle where we're really trying to build the future. We're building something that doesn't really exist. And if we think about it from a user experience perspective, we've sort of lost some of these first principles where if we take ChatGPT, for example, you can't even inline respond to a response. Like you can't comment to it, you can't really interact and collaborate with it. You're really starting fresh every time, or you're asking it to make edits on this grand, big, response that it might have provided you with. So when you're chatting with designers and you're giving them advice and mentoring them, do you find that they're more focused on these sort of bigger, grander problems, or, are they thinking more at that first principles level, using human-centered design in a way it should have been with these products that are actually going to change the world?
Yeah. This is such a new technology and it's so chaotic. I don't think anybody has a strong understanding of that. So I don't think anyone feels like they're in a position to make that choice. We're just trying to understand just how the balls are bouncing right now. You hinted at something that I feel is showing how vague this is, right? You can ask ChatGPT to do something or Stable Diffusion, and it will do it. And then you try to refine it and you can't, right? The tool is like fundamentally broken. There's a great YouTube video of a guy asking for Stable Diffusion for ramen noodles and has chopsticks. And he asks it to take out the chopsticks and it won't. And he asks it to show him the chopsticks and shows it. And he says, "No, get rid," and it won't. It can't do ramen without chopsticks because the tools are so primitive at this point. It's really hard to use them in the way that I think we would like to use, which is more incremental. So you're asking, I think, how to use the tool, which I want to make sure we talk about, but I'm also trying to say that the tools are really bad. And so it affects our ability to even use them at all. For example, when Stable Diffusion makes a picture, it doesn't just give me a bunch of pixels. It actually has an internal representation of what it did. So I can say, okay, can you identify this chopsticks? Move them to the right. Because what happens today is you have to like regenerate it and start all over again. And so you get a whole different thing. So there's no ability to talk to the thing you just created. It's an all or nothing type of tool technique. And that is just not sustainable. So it's these fundamentally difficult things that make me wonder how we can move forward with this technology.
Yeah, this makes me go back to the earlier kind of thought I had, which is, you have this first line, the body of knowledge, the open AIs, the Geminis and such, but then you have these tools built on top of it, which are more focused agents, more clear capabilities. And it seems like the use cases are going to break out that way. Siri failed in many respects because he couldn't handle basic things. But now when we look at what people want, and I've been doing a lot of research lately with actual end consumers of what AI users want, they just want Siri to do what it was supposed to do. Business users, on the other hand, they want some complexity. They want to save time. They want some ROI. They want to regain their day. It's pretty significant. And it really seems like the industry, as much as we thought there's going to be this big overlord tool, it's probably going to break out exactly the way it was. And it's just going to be a new era of SaaS tools. What do you see happening?
I've seen this pattern before. We had this thing with IoT before and other things. It's like someone hands you a battery and says, go make something electronic. It's like, it's a battery. I mean, like, what am I going to do with this? And I think a lot of ways, this whole generative AI is a lower level technology. It's like, go make something AI is a meaningless, unmotivated sentence. So to your point, whether it's a SaaS tool or a make.com or whether it's a writing tool, we have to get back to the nuts and bolts. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? And maybe make the AI completely invisible, right? It's just something that we use internally. I think that we will have matured when we stop using AI as the reason and more as the enabler. And when you make it the reason, you've got it totally backwards because it's not doing anything that the users want.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and in many ways, we're not in an AI era. We're in like a big data plus era.
Yeah.
There's just more big data out there. There's more tools that can interact with the big data. I don't even know if we're actually really in an AI real era yet.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I hate the word that we use AI. We anthropomorphize this stuff so much. I think when we first talked, I told you the story about a professor who, to his students, had a pencil with googly eyes on it. And he jumped it all around and said, hey, I'm Timmy, and I love drawing and helping kids with their homework. And all the kids were smiling in his class. And then without warning, he grabbed the pencil and he snapped it. And half the kids gasped. And he said, that's why we're in this AI hype cycle right now. We're crap at doing actual cognitive models, but we're great at assuming things are alive and anthropomorphic. And so the fact that we use the word hallucination, the fact that we call it AI, when it's neither of those things, is, I think, making us not see what's really happening here.
Obviously, there's a lot of pitfalls and a lot of challenges with the state of it right now. But it does seem like there's something special that's happened with artificial intelligence, or whatever we want to refer to it as. Maybe it's less anthropomorphized. And it does have the potential to change how we interact with technology. So where do you see AI having the greatest opportunities to deliver real impact?
Where it's clearly happening is where it's sticking to what it's good at, which is text and language and manipulation. So obviously, tech support chatbots are going to town with this, right? And that's huge, right? That's not as big as I think you wanted me to answer, but I'm saying let's pick the things that are really winning, right? All sorts of like the Grammarly replacements where you're analyzing text. There's a lot of discussion about doing research in law where you can scan a bunch of stuff and find precedents and link things back and forth. Anything that involves large volumes of text that you have to parse and analyze and synthesize seems to be like a clear win. And so I think we're going to get a ton of value from that. It's still, I'll go back to my Figma example, I still don't see how it's going to revolutionize Figma. And I'm happy to be wrong on that one. I just don't see the path. Now, I'm not saying we can't do things like filling in text, using component systems. There will be uses of it. But the fact that it's going to replace my ability to do components and drawing and layouts, it will likely be a much harder problem, is all I'm saying. And we'll get there, but it may be a while.
I think we talked about this before, that there's this challenge with these AI tools speaking to each other in the background. But do you see a world in the near-term future where there is that valuable use of AI, where it can be having these conversations between different apps and technologies in the background where it does provide real value?
I think anytime an AI can be used to moderate or mitigate, I think that is a very powerful metaphor. Years ago, I wrote a paper about having negotiated APIs. so that you could actually not have humans talking to machines or machines talking to machines, but my API could talk to your API, and we would actually have an API that would transmogrify my request into your request and back again. So I think there's all sorts of really fascinating ways that this impedance matching could happen. Google, for example, has shown that you can be put on hold on a telephone call, and it will monitor the phone call and it will let you know when the hold is up. It can even answer simple questions. So I do feel like there's an interesting direction in that sense, but it's also a very, very narrow topic. So I'm not quite sure I'm ready to have it book a flight for me yet, right? Because the costs are too high and there's just too much nuance as to what is a bad flight for me. But having it order a pizza for me, fine. So again, this vocabulary of what is a human interaction, what's at stake, what are the consequences, we haven't got a very nuanced level of conversation to say what I can hand off to an AI and what I won't.
To be fair, though, I think that there is a huge area of opportunity because there's so many times when you're trying to complete a task and you recognize that the UX is broken. So let's take, for example, booking a flight. You talked about that. Why should I need to go book a flight and re-enter my information every time? Why can my
Yeah,
system not remember these things?
totally.
But on the other end of the spectrum, I mentioned that people just want what Siri was supposed to do. And some of these things are, and I brought this example up previously, it's just like, I have maybe 4 Google calendars, and it took someone noticing, hey, you're double booked here. The system should tell me this. This is a breakdown in the UX. This is the role of UX, and a designer can build these contingencies, and the tool can really support them in that. And when we think about Figma, Figma could have the potential of adding a whole layer of experimentation, right? A lot of the design industry is just refreshes, refresh, refresh. And in
Mhm.
theory, you could generate refreshes, get adaptability going, you can get some testing going on these refreshes, and it could help solve that first draft problem. And this is one of the consistent use cases we've been hearing. Another use case, which has been consistently brought up by people, is coding, where coding is basically matching 2 documents. Is like, what should the code be? What have you delivered? Do they align? Yes or no? And coding is going to be massive. Like, it's just
Yes.
such a huge use case, and it's going to change it all. Where I actually don't even know if I'd encourage my kid to want to go into engineering or if it's better to be a designer right now, because designers are the ones that are going to spot what the technology fails at. An engineer, I don't know if they could right now.
Well, and there's been some fascinating conversations on Reddit about this because people are saying there's so much more to coding than doing a for loop, right? And there's and so much of coding is maintaining that code. And so I've found that ChatGPT can easily produce compilable code that works. And sometimes it's pretty crap code too. So I would feel like just like design isn't going to go away, I don't think programming is going to go away. For example, writing test cases, testing functions. No programmer likes to do that. And I bet AI would be awesome at that, right? So I do feel like programming is going to be elevated, but I don't think it's going to be replaced because I don't think we appreciate how much of programming is not doing for loops and is these higher level functions. So it will change it, of course. But if anything, I think the ability to be even more impactful. The risk, of course, is that you may need fewer programmers.
Probably 15 years ago or more, mobile devices really changed everything, right? And you played a big part in designing the products that Apple and Google created that were a part of that big leap forward. So, do you have any predictions about, how the launch of AI phones in particular will change the role of design and how designers can interact with that technology?
I would be very foolish to make a proposal, a prediction as to where that's going to go. But what I will say is, I think is how it's going to be used is much more predictable. And this was the very first post I did on LinkedIn, which is it will be used to create moats, right? We can already see this happening with Apple and making the developers apps more of a commodity. You break your app up into a bunch of individual pieces that Siri will then package up and hand off to you. That's going to create a really intense ecosystem if they can pull it off, and it's going to kind of lock people in. So there is going to be, I think, that aspect of it. I mentioned previously that it's going to possibly, and this is a very, very weak prediction on my part, redefine what an application even is. Right? You heard the term being Sherlocked. It's a term that's used when one of the original applications that was a utility on Apple was called Sherlock, and then Apple built the functionality in the operating system and completely put them out of business. As we build these bookends, I talked about data in and visualization out. As the operating system starts doing more and more and more of this, it's not unreasonable to think that the need for bespoke applications is going to go down and the entire app ecosystem is going to possibly shrink, with maybe the exception of games, right? But a lot of what we think of today as calorie monitoring and exercise apps and so forth can be possibly pulled into the operating system. So that's something that I'm fascinated with, but that's very much an experimental idea.
When you look at the current state of generative AI and the battle of Gen AI versus search, one of the victims here will be just regular blogs and just the average website. They're just mulch at this point. So to your point, what other businesses that we currently consider businesses that have an app are just going to turn into APIs or just going to get fully replaced? And I think there's some real questions there about if you have an assistant, who they do business with is faceless. And when you have voice-based results where it just tells you the top two, the whole idea of the long tail, which is the foundation of the internet and democratization of industry, what happens to that idea in the future?
I still publish to my blog and I get a tremendous amount out of it. The fact that an LLM can parse it is a separate conversation about owning my content, but I still get a tremendous amount out of it. And I have people that read my stuff and then contact me. So I'm not convinced that blogs are dead yet. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Well, Google is basically a library science tool. It's a library data management tool where it presents information in a prioritized list where you make a decision. You make an informed decision by auditing each one. If
Mhm.
we move to this new model where things are summarized and the sources are just footnotes, how many people are actually going to click on those footnotes? How many people are going to know whether this is just scouring the top 10 results that it's related to, the top 100? And again, if we go back to, Chris Anderson's book about the long tail, the idea of micro industries on the internet was that people were always going to seek out the most niche use cases possible and the most niche information. Blogs have been the foundation of that. Will
Yeah.
they exist? I don't know, right? Like obviously, we have all these Substacks, we have these niche newsletters, but will it be the way that it was before? It used to be 10 years ago, you throw up a mom's travel blog and you could make a good side business off that. I just feel like those days are probably coming to an end.
Well, you raise a really interesting question, which is why do people read blogs? And I don't think I don't think the majority use case for blogs is to summarize them. When my family traveled for a year, we actually had a blog and it was just for our family and people loved to see what we were up to. So I think that this is a good example, though, of how we're extrapolating things with maybe not appreciating the finer issues of what's happening. I don't know how to answer your question. I don't think there is a way to definitively answer it. But what I am saying is, I feel like we can extrapolate too much and we can assume that a summarization is enough. And I question that. I mean, it will happen. I'm not saying you're wrong, but it's not clear to me that that is going to kill everything. For example, people keep talking about intelligence as if it's a mathematical thing, and they separate culture from algorithm. And I think so much of what intelligence is humanity. It's like we like square dancing, right? We like cognac. And, there's all these things that are tied to us being human that is part of our intelligence. And I don't think that gets enough discussion. And so, as a UX designer, I'm going to be pushing back on questions like that because I don't think we really can make broad statements like that because I think there's so much more that we haven't really articulated yet. That's why we go to the internet. That's why we go to these niche sites. So I'm not answering your question. I'm just saying is I think it's a hard question.
Yeah. So then going back to the basics here and the designers that seek help and coaching, what roadmap do you suggest for them to strengthen and enhance their own futures?
First of all, use this technology. I use ChatGPT and Gemini every day because I'm trying to learn more about it and to figure out the grain of it. The more you can play with this technology, you can start to talk about what are small hills and what are big hills. That doesn't mean anything is impossible, but it means that you can at least pick an easier hill to climb when you're asked to do something. For example, today, if someone asked me to do something, I would really try hard to push it in towards a text manipulation task, if at all possible, because we know it's good at that. That doesn't mean we can't do something bigger. The more you can understand this, the more you can help shape what it's going to be. That doesn't mean you know the answer, but you know where to start building.
We had a number of designers who've been down in the trenches. And there's a lot of different points of view, right? There's a point of view that designers are going to move up in terms of decision tree and become more service oriented, that designers are going to have to become more technicians of the models, that designers are going to become basically like a first order prompt engineering team. Like there's a lot of different directions that designers can go and a lot of capabilities. Again, what do you typically suggest for them in terms of where the work likely will be for them?
Well, first, just don't panic. It is the case that 95% of all UX work is probably doing pretty standard stuff. A restaurant website, a banking application. So if you are going to do a really, really boring application, there's a very good likelihood that it can be auto-generated. It won't be very good. It'll be exactly like every other app out there. And so there is that impact that the boring stuff will be automated. But then the question becomes is, well, what's the not boring stuff? And where can it be of value? Like, do you need this app, or what's the aspect of this app that you should be doing? So I don't want to be naive and say it won't have an impact, but it seems really overly strong to say it will blow up the entire industry and there'll be
Oh,
no need for us
for sure.
whatsoever. Yeah.
Sometimes the
Um,
best way to look forward is to look backwards. When mobile apps first came out, if you look back when the App Store first started, most of the apps were just useless things. You had like an app that would make farting noises, a ruler app. You would have things that are just like
a,
really,
a beer drinking app. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mhm.
yeah, they're really dumb things. And then as the toolkit started building out more, there was more room for design to have influence. We started building the Swift kit and there were libraries that started, the power that a designer had just went up exponentially. I'm wondering if you had any lessons from what it was like being a designer in that era where you were at that point, you were hand coding most things and then it changed so quickly over 5, 10 years.
I would argue, though, that those goofy things are lovely. They're exactly what you need, right? You need to splash in puddles as a child and you need to figure out the physics of water. And so these apps are fun and they're experimental and they're goofy. And same thing, by the way, with the mobile web at first, right? And we had to develop the patterns necessary to shrink your web page so it would fit on a mobile web page. And what did that mean? And how did you even manage that? And then you get to the business case. Well, how do you write code that is responsive so it works on your main desktop and your small desktop? Those are the mechanical problems. From the history of mobile, we are going to just have to do an awful lot of experiment. All I know is that until we build it, we won't have the vocabulary to know what we want to do. And that's, I hope, the theme of what I'm trying to say in our conversation today is I can't predict. But all I know is that the only way forward is through, and that we have to be building these things. And I am quite sure that we'll be building far less than people think we're going to be building because the tools are overhyped. And it's that kind of maniacal insistence that I have on building things and learning that is the only technique I have to kind of see our way through this.
That's wonderful. And you mentioned that a lot of those initial apps that first launched the mobile world, and some of them were very simplistic, but they were experiments. Are there any experiments you're seeing today with AI that you find are really intriguing or really impressed you that are kind of making your head turn in new ways about what might be possible?
Yeah, this is going to seem really obvious, but like the slew of meeting note taking apps. You'll add one of these things to your meeting and it will transcribe the whole meeting. It will create a higher level list of key points and then it'll have like action items. That is astounding to me. And it has revolutionized how I do mentoring because I don't have to take notes anymore. I can focus on the person and I can be more human in the meeting. Now, that's not exactly rocket science, and people know that one, I'm sure. But I mean, it does show you that when the stuff works, it can work really, really well. and it's not taking anybody's job away, right? As far as these other things, I do feel when we understand, for example, what I thought I was going to write a talk, and I downloaded a whole bunch of PDFs. I'm like, okay, I'm ready. Come on, ChatGPT, impress me, right? And I loaded up all these PDFs, and I tried to have it summarize it. And half the time, it would just give me the abstract from the paper when I asked it to summarize. And it says, to know more, please read the PDF. I'm like, thanks, ChatGPT. That was useless. So actually, I have found that its summarization capabilities has limits. I don't understand. Sometimes it's amazing, and sometimes it's like it just gives up. And this is what I mean by vocabulary and learning. I guess what I'm trying to say is my positive experiences have been lumpy, right? They've been good and weird. I haven't seen anything that's kind of hit it out of the park. And by the way, back to your point of the video recording things, they all have terrible UX, right? They don't join the meeting well. They don't end the meeting well. They have reliability problems. So it's like they're working, but kind of not. And all the reasons they don't work have nothing to do with generative AI. And so I do feel like just doing the plumbing is going to be a big part of these things actually being better products.
And have you seen any new interesting design patterns emerge? And let's say, for example, Google Maps was, best in class when it came out, and then Waze came out. And Waze is an entirely new pattern because it's all based on user input and it's
Mm-hmm.
reflexive to an ecosystem of contributors. And that's impressive. It's a whole new way of looking at your city and getting through it. Have you seen anything on that kind of level where it's just like flipping the model on something that we thought was solved?
In relationship to generative AI in particular,
Yeah,
uh,
leveraging it as a material in an existing use case.
I love your example. I think that makes an awful lot of sense. And I absolutely believe that that's going to happen. The only thing that I would say that's flipped on my head is as a UX designer, I wanted to have an interactive prototype. And I knew that processing was probably the right tool. I don't know if your listeners know about processing, but it's a lovely, very rich programming environment with lots of libraries and things. And I'm like, I used it 15 years ago. I'm not really, I just dreaded the idea. And I just went to ChatGPT and I said, give me a processing app that just animates this thing. And boop, it just popped out. And it just blew my mind because it compiled the first time. And so that is, to me, what's really fascinating is it allows someone like me, who's not a professional programmer, to do programming in service of my ability. So I have a whole new superpower. That to me is really fascinating. Of course, by the 10th time I revised it, the code no longer compiled, which is like, welcome to generative AI. It works until it doesn't. And so now I have this really weird process where I will, every time something kind of works, I save it as a file so that when ChatGPT wanders off into the weeds and creates non-compiling code, I throw that away, reload the file, and I do it again. So now we are changing in order to work around the limitations of ChatGPT. Now, that may go away over time. It shocked me how much it improved my ability as a UX designer to write interactive code because I would have never considered that before. But as to what it will do for other applications, I do think it's going to be fascinating what it can do to monitor things and do things in the background and possibly even clean things up. And so I'm intrigued with the ability for it to not be a frontmost technology, but to be a background technology. And whether that's cleaning up my contacts, whether that's reorganizing my folder system, I think there's some really intriguing directions where it could just be in the background suggesting some things that just makes my life better, and I hardly even notice it's there. It just works.
And to that point, one of the use cases that I'm seeing pop up over and over again is the idea that you should never have to go into the settings anymore. You should just tell it what you want and it figures out how to do the settings. And I think that'll be amazing. But I think the overarching theme of our conversation today is obviously the hype cycle of AI and where we are in it. And it seems like right now in this current stage, it's a stage of experimentation. And you pointed to a couple stories where you can try out things that are outside of your domain. It's fascinating. And maybe that should be the lesson for anyone listening here is this is a time to try things out, see where
Absolutely.
your wings can go, build things that you never thought possible because what you were 2 years ago, probably not where you're going to be 2 years from now. And hopefully you're pointing in a direction that's a little more enjoyable, a little more fun, a little bit more you, and hopefully a little more profitable. Any final words before we close out today's conversation?
I'd like to just build on what you just said. Absolutely, people should be trying these things, but they should also be listing and writing down what doesn't work. Because so often I think people, when it fails, think it's their fault. I mean, as UX designers, we know this, right? And yet we don't apply that to ourselves. So when you're trying these new generative technologies and it's not working, write it down. Think about it, because you know what? It's probably a weak point. It's not you. And understanding that and figuring out either how to get around it or what it means is going to help you with your next conversation, because as you appreciate the limitations of these things, you will become a better designer. And that's all I can offer. I am not an expert in generative AI. I'm a UX person, and that's the pattern I think all of us follow, is just prototype and test, prototype and test. But I think too many junior designers don't listen to their experience. I hope they would.
Now, if people want to follow along with your thoughts, ideas, lessons, where's the best way to find that?
I'm most active on Mastodon, but strangely enough, LinkedIn is becoming like the new professional Twitter. And so I'm quite active on LinkedIn as well. And there's my blog, jenson.org, Jenson. And I publish there rarely, a couple times a year. And if you go to jenson.org, you can find links to all the things I just gave you.
It's been a wonderful speaking with you, Scott. It's been a great adventure. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was a thoughtful conversation. You guys had excellent questions. I really enjoyed it too. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. The show is hosted by Brittany Hobbs and Arpi Drake Figueredo. Subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple to get our latest episodes. We speak to leaders at the forefront of AI to learn how great AI products are designed and how they're transforming industries. To contact us, visit our website, designof.ai.